Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us again for another Apprenticeship Insights podcast with our experts, Bally Bhogal from the LX Group and Natalie Ray of Natalie Ray Consultancy. And on this edition of our podcast, we've got something a bit more in tune with the apprenticeship sector overall, and something which might stir some thoughts and might raise a lot of questions. I'm sure everyone has strong opinions on this one. We're actually going to look at how apprenticeship training providers use apprenticeships to train their own staff, and of course their use of apprenticeship funding and how to develop their own workforce in that manner. We're going to look at the barriers and opportunities that the training providers face, and of course the solutions to that. And hopefully you'll find this very, very useful as per our other podcasts as well. So, Bally, first of all, hi, good afternoon. How are you?
I'm good, thank you, Vinh. How are you?
I'm absolutely fantastic. Thank you. Thank you for joining us once again for this podcast. Your insights will, as always, be invaluable. And Natalie as well, great to hear from you again. How have you been?
Really good, thank you. Again, it's a pleasure to be here and really excited about having this particular conversation with both yourselves this afternoon.
And with that, let's jump straight into it. So Natalie, first over to you. I wanted to find out your thoughts on how training providers use the funding. Of course, funding is always an important subject when it comes to apprenticeships. So how best can training providers use that funding to support their own staff development, would you say?
Well, I think to start us off, one of the reasons why we wanted to have this conversation is we obviously understand the role of training providers and their remit in supporting businesses and employers and apprentices through that training by offering training and apprenticeship programmes. But it's about sort of raising the idea or the challenges and barriers faced this afternoon about how training providers can actually use that training provision to themselves as businesses. Whilst they are training providers, they're organisations, they're businesses, they have staff, and there's always going to be those organisational and staff development needs. And it's really interesting in our experience to be able to see some utilisation of apprenticeship provision within that context internally for training providers, but also probably a requirement for some further uptake. So in the same way that we would as providers encourage our employers and clients to engage in apprenticeship provision, whether that's to meet talent acquisition, staff recruitment and staff development opportunities, we would expect, or we would sort of try to raise the opportunity here for training providers to do very much the same. Apprenticeships can be matched, as we know, to new staff members when they're being recruited into an organisation, or they can be put alongside an existing member of that staff to utilise or support organisational or staff personal professional development needs. So long as there is evidence of new skills required and that the job role, as we know when we say to our employers, it matches the requirements of that apprenticeship standard or programme, then there's lots of available opportunity for training providers to engage with apprenticeships for their own internal reasons. So training providers are also employers, regardless of their size. So whether it be through utilising the levy funds, co-investment contributions, or fully government funded opportunities, there are lots of benefits to them as training providers and organisations to support their institutions or, their workforce.
That's pretty clear. Thank you so much, Natalie. Bally, I was wondering your thoughts on that as well. In your experience, when it comes to training providers, how do they best use their funding to support their own staff development?
It's a really interesting area, and I sometimes find in my experience, and when I've spoken to colleagues in the sector as well, that often training providers are so busy in delivering apprenticeships or any other funded learning programs, work-based, learning programs to their clients, that sometimes they forget to turn the lens inwards and look to consider how can they apply this opportunity, if you like, to develop their own staff. So in my experience, it's a conversation that needs to be had. It's opportune at the moment to be had, especially because now we have we're almost at a critical point really with recruiting and retaining our staff within the sector. It's kind of almost escalated since COVID. So, those teachers, those trainers, those quality assurers, the assessors, obviously you've got the business administrators, but our organisations have become heavily reliant on systems. So you could even look at sort of business analysts, IT colleagues, etc. So there's a great opportunity to be able to stand back and think, okay, how are we utilising the levy for ourselves, but it's often not done in that way. So we wanted to have this conversation through this podcast. And probably the only thing I'd mention, the other thing is that there is a requirement to have a staff development policy as part of your submission and application to the APAR, the registration process and register for apprenticeship training providers. So I think this is really comes to the forefront now, but how this is being done, what approach is being taken to staff development, I think we're still going to have a really good conversation around this in this podcast, and it still is, there's a lot to be seen in terms of how that starts to unravel in the next sort of few years, if you like, if not the next few months.
I'm glad you said that, Bally, because great conversations is something we always have here. So we will definitely be going into further detail on that later. Natalie, you mentioned the opportunities available to develop staff within a provider. Would you want to elaborate on that at all? What kind of opportunities are available? Which roles would cover those opportunities?
Absolutely, and I think it's just important to, I was listening to Bally quite rightly talk about some of those like challenges and ways in which we can utilise apprenticeships for an organisation. And it made me smile because I think we spend so much time sort of professionally in our roles at the moment, our previous experience, but also working with clients around the kind of, it's exactly the same conversation we would be having with employers and businesses about sort of supporting those conversations to engage in apprenticeships. So I think there's going to be a bit of a theme through this podcast of saying, well, it's very much the same as what we would offer outwards and that advice. And it's, as you said, quite rightly, both of you, it's sort of flipping that narrative and showing an internal lens on exactly this conversation. So it's the same opportunities that are available to employers and businesses of a varying degree or range of different sort of sectors. But if we look at the typical sort of infrastructure or organisation structure of a training provider, and again, this would be individual to each organisation, but if we look at those typical roles, we'll see all of those kind of what we call back office support, administration and managerial roles. They can all be supported by available apprenticeships. So that would be in the sort of roles of administration, customer service, maybe marketing, management. There's availability across management at varying levels from level 3 all the way up to level 7 senior leader. There's sales type apprenticeships or targeted apprenticeships that might support the business development or external engagement teams. And then you've kind of got the IT services and digital support roles that sit within apprenticeship provision. In addition to sort of those more supportive back office roles, there are a range of apprenticeships that are available that can be dedicated to the development and professional development of apprenticeship delivery, teaching and contact staff. So that's looking at your sort of learning and skills assessor, mentor and teacher apprenticeships. There's teacher and teaching assistants, academic professionals. So they would cover various ranges of levels as well and would suit many roles around that kind of typical training provider and apprenticeship support and delivery provision.
A very comprehensive list, Natalie. Thank you. I was just wondering, Bally, was there any more you wanted to add to that list at all, or opportunities that are available?
Probably the only one that I would add there is because our sector, again, the businesses are becoming so heavily reliant on social media. It's probably the social media sort of digital assistant. And remember when I was employed in a very large training provider, some of my own apprentices that I coached and managed in my team, I had about 9 apprentices, probably about maybe 3 or 4 of them were on the business admin, 2 or 3 on the customer service. I had 1 or 2 on the social and digital media skills apprenticeship. And in those days, the sort of whole digital media things were just taking off. But the organisation that I was working for was very, very hands-on in this area, and they were almost flying the flag, very disruptive in the area of social media. So they were very, very keen to get some of our younger apprentices certainly joining the organisation on that. I think they were pretty enthusiastic as well. It's new technologies, it was very, very fast, very fluid, new area. So yeah, that suited them particularly. So I know that we had 1 or 2 of them on that. But no, Natalie's provided a really comprehensive list there. Probably the only thing I'd say is that I haven't in my lifetime seen very many individuals that work in the delivery teams on structured apprenticeship programs, which is probably a bit of a discussion in itself. But yeah, it's really good to hear Natalie mention those, that actually, unless anybody's actually forgotten, they are there and they are available to training providers, regardless of type of training provider, for developing delivery staff.
See, Bally, thank you for that, and that was fantastic. You did allude to a lack of some types of roles, and that might present due to some of the challenges that they're facing when using the apprenticeship funding. So within the training providers setting, Bally, what kind of challenges do you think they're facing at this time, such as maybe time or budgets and so on and so forth? What kind of challenges, in your view, are they facing at this time?
I think one of the biggest challenges that are being faced by the sector at the minute is retention of staff, and that's across the piece, whether it's BDMs, and probably we haven't even talked about BDMs because sales is another apprenticeship that is available, and that would be really, really useful to our colleagues in employer engagement and sales. But there is that whole, just if I just contextualize it, currently there's a big sort of staff shortage, staff are moving on. There was a bit of migration towards endpoint assessment a few years ago as well. So there was that natural sort of lost, but there was a bit of movement in the sector towards endpoint assessment when that was new and that came out. So just as filling the funnel with new trainers, new assessors, new deliverers, quality assurers, but then also building from bottom up. So taking that bottom up approach. So having that talent management strategy as well. And I'm not sure how robust that is in terms of how well developed that is in our organizations in our sector. But that aside, and the fact that we've just contextually just placing that out there, putting that out there, time is a big issue. That's a big challenge, for providers. They're extremely busy delivering apprenticeships to their clients, and always there to trying to please and bring learners on. But sometimes they could potentially forget to prioritize their own staff development and CPD. So time's a big one. The other one that you mentioned, just touched upon there, Vinh, is the budgets. Another challenge. So whilst they could get apprenticeship funding, as we all know, through the normal rates in terms of government funding and the funding rules, if there is a challenge around topping up, so paying that co-investment part, that could be a challenge for organisations. If it's a case that they're not looking to go down the apprenticeship route, just budgets for paying for even CPD could potentially be a challenge. So we'll leave that one on the table. So it's always going to be dependent on how much money is available for training staff. And then sometimes we all know when you're working with businesses that when you're going through a tough time, some of the first budgets to go are training and marketing budgets, but they're so critical, aren't they? When you're going through challenging times in a business, we know that. And then time of the year, if you look at seasonal, when to actually develop staff, so to deliver training to our staff in our sector, there is this kind of notion of, look, we don't really want to disrupt studies for other students, for our clients, for our employers. And then it's that trying to just avoid those peak times. So for example, September recruitment period, those exam seasons where, our learners might need us more. We're probably engaged as practitioners more in those helping to prepare, providing that pastoral care, being the first point of contact for our learners even during that time. So we have to be available then. Christmas, summer, obviously holidays, personal commitments, etc. So in my experience, and I'd love to get Natalie's take on this, training is more likely to take place in the quieter times, which tends to be sort of towards the end of June, maybe July more so, when the exam seasons are over and people are basically just thinking holidays tend to take place then and before the start of a new kind of academic year in August. And then it's about the type of training. That could be another challenge. That do we go after a long structured apprenticeship program that could take potentially years, or shall we deliver in-house training ourselves, perhaps appoint one of our staff members to give spotlight sessions, CPD, additional support, or use of consultants, external facilitators. But in my experience, I've also found quite a lot of use and application of higher level apprenticeships, degree apprenticeships to management level roles, as well as sort of those business administration apprenticeships and customer services to those kind of layers that support all of the operations within an organisation. I kind of know those are the first sort of things that come to my mind, spring to my mind.
There is plenty, and I would 100% agree with you that when it comes to budget cuts, unfortunately, training is always one of the first areas affected. But exactly as you say, Bally, training is so important to any industry, any organization. Let's hope that the insights that we're both giving here, both yourself and Natalie, are going to change that attitude. Natalie, was there anything you wanted to add to the question, what key challenges are surrounding apprenticeship funding?
Yeah, I think just to sort of extend from an earlier point for Bally around the time of year is we would say if we were working to tell training providers how to meet the needs of other sectors in which we serve, that you would want to represent in the delivery or the planning of the apprenticeship programme, work with that employer and that sector to identify peak areas, winter pressures for sort of, if you're looking at sort of NHS and health provision, Bally mentioned those holiday periods, Christmas, etc. So you'd want to sort of have those conversations with the employers to identify what works and what delivery model, how flexible can we be with our approach to support that. And again, it's about having that internal conversation. We are education and training provision. What are our areas of pressure points throughout the year, and how could we make some of that internal delivery meet the needs of operational practice in the service we deliver externally to our apprentices and our employers, but also how can we make that fit internally? And I guess it's a hard thing to do, but it is possible. I think the only other addition is that sometimes some of the challenges that we've got, and again, it's that ongoing conversation of what we experience when we speak to employers and big organisations, small organisations, when we are a training provider trying to engage, is sometimes there's a lack of ownership of sort of that staff training requirement within big organisations or small organisations. Even if there is ownership, sometimes it doesn't sit at the right part of the organisation, or it doesn't link to strategy or organisational approach or staff CPD and development in the same way. So sometimes where there's that kind of lack of ownership or lack of whole organisational approach and connectivity around the apprenticeship training and staff development conversation, that becomes a bit of a challenge and a barrier. So we're sort of moving into a bit of a solution there, but it's really about identifying a key person to own that and make sure it aligns with lots of other strategy or other approaches or objectives, ambitions and actions within the organisation too.
Fantastic, Natalie, thank you so much. Obviously, we focus on apprenticeships here, but what I was really curious about is how they differ or are similar to those faced in other sectors or businesses when they're looking to integrate apprenticeship development into the wider business as well. I think the comparison would be very valuable to hear of. Natalie, let's go with you first. What similarities are there between this business and others?
I think, again, it's just to sort of extend the point that we started to make here, is that the similarities are very, what we experience internally is very much the conversation we should and are are sort of tackling with our client base. The conversation still stands. It's just not, it's sometimes not sort of joined up or thought of in that way. So it's important to raise that part of the conversation, that actually we've got to sort of practice what we preach. And that's if we are engaged, are we doing a really good job with the delivery of internal apprenticeships as the provider and as the employer. It's similar conversations that Bally and I and some of our colleagues would have with employer providers, where that is that kind of sort of setup and makeup. So we need to make sure that we identify the challenges faced, and when they're known, that they're recognised within internal provision, so that we can shine a light on the difficulties as well. So what I mean by that is identifying some of these similarities we have as a training provider with our internal apprenticeship provision, lack thereof, or good practice, is very much the same conversation we should be having with our employers. So to be able to use that in two lenses, not only does that help us understand that we actually have a toolkit that we offer to advise our employers to make it work, that we can use internally, but it also could probably support us with some better understanding when we're trying to negotiate, have some of those conversations, do some of those planning meetings with employers. So they're quite complementary of each other, that part of the conversation.
Bally, what similarities and differences have you foreseen in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Nat said there. I think for me, I mean, I'm sat here sort of almost reflecting at the same time as I'm listening in. And I think actually it's really difficult. It's a really tough ask, actually, when you're delivering a product and then you have to almost kind of look at yourself. Then you've done a complete U-turn and you're looking at yourselves then as an organization. You try to apply the same methodologies and principles and processes, if you like, to yourselves. So identifying your own training needs and having your own company training plan, knowing what your priorities are. I think when you're so outward focused in this world, it's really tough to actually change direction and look at it, do a complete U-turn and do the same thing for yourself. So I think that is quite a challenge, and it's quite a tough one as well. But in terms of going back to the question, so that was just me reflecting there, but going back to some of the similarities, I do believe that if I'll just itemize it out, because what's going through in my head is some of those challenges by and large are very, very similar. So I think training providers do obviously appreciate apprenticeships, but they equally, obviously they're deliverers, right? So they appreciate them, they value them, but they also potentially sense that perceived loss of staff time whilst staff are undertaking their off-the-job training. So I think there is a sense of, if we put staff on apprenticeships, we could potentially lose them. There's already a challenge, significant challenge in the sector with staff availability due to the shortages and retention, if you like. So there is that, you know, would we be able to backfill somebody if they're on an apprenticeship program? So is that perceived loss of time, that reduction, that downtime, if you like, and almost it's probably perceived as a loss as opposed to an investment at that time. And then you have line managers. You know, do training providers have the right line managers, have the mentors, have the buy-in of those individuals? Do they have the right skills in those line managers, mentors, to be able to take on those mentees from within the organisation? And then there is also the embedding of the apprenticeship programs within the business. So if you have a staff training policy, what does that actually look like, and where do you need to deploy apprenticeships? Where are they? Where's the best fit, if you like? So who's done that analysis? What does that look like, and which roles do they apply to? Is it feasible? Who's done the feasibility? Who's done the sort of, if you like, the viability from a loss of staff perspective, and infilling and looking at budgets to see if they need to bring somebody in? So there's those sorts of similarities would be the same if I were to itemize those out. However, I think one of the biggest, in my experience anyway, one of the biggest challenges I've found is the provider buy-in. So just their own buy-in, the business buy-in into apprenticeships. And it's a bit ironic, really, because they are apprenticeship training providers themselves. I've never been entirely sure if it's driven by just not having the resource or the capability or the capacity to be able to plan, integrate, embed, deploy apprenticeships within the business effectively, or if there's potentially an underlying fear of potentially losing staff who are then trained, well trained, highly trained, to potentially other providers. There might be a commercial sensitivity issue as well, from a perspective of if they cannot deliver a specific apprenticeship and they have to bring an outside provider in, an external provider in, could they be a competitor? So there's that commercial sensitivity as well, in as much as do they want somebody, another provider, to come into their own provider setting to deliver apprenticeships to them. So there are a number of things that go kind of through my head. So there's a few little differences plus some similarities. Hopefully that makes sense in the way that I've described them.
It does make sense, thank you. And I was just thinking, it's quite ironic, thinking how apprenticeship training providers themselves are encountering these challenges within their own businesses. You would think that they are, of course, most accustomed to them. But what's your thoughts on that? Is there an irony in apprenticeship training providers themselves being challenged by using and applying their own apprenticeship funding?
If you're asking me, Vinh, then I would say, yeah, I think I've definitely sensed that there is an irony that exists within the sector, and in my experience, it's not just limited to colleges. It is sort of difficult to pinpoint. We don't have any statistics on it or any exact sort of insights. You know, which type of provider does it relate to more? Is it prevalent in more? But you know, I can only talk of my own sort of experience, my lived experience, that I tend to find that universities and employer providers are probably the most proactive in training their own staff through apprenticeships. And this includes applying apprenticeships to some of their delivery teams. It might not be massive in scale, numbers, volumes, but certainly they tend to be, in my experience, the most proactive. And then even if you look at CPD, so non-apprenticeship training, you know, it might be things like micro-learning, bite-sized training events, facilitated online webinars, workshops, you know, conferences, all that sort of standardization, team meetings. That's the same as well. I tend to find that in kind of universities, some of the sort of bigger, larger training providers, private training providers. It's a difficult one to try to pinpoint down to specifics in terms of where is the irony exactly. It does exist, but I struggle to sort of pinpoint that down. I don't know if Natalie can help us on that further.
I think so. I think I agree there's irony, but I think there's also opportunity that comes from this as well. And I think that's an important way to look at it. I think from the list of where you talked about some of those learning solutions that might exist within institutions, where you listed a few that sit outside of sort of apprenticeship levy and apprenticeship programmes, the micro-learning, the in-house, the standardisation meetings. If you think about it, if we have the opportunity to sort of zoom out and consolidate some of that training that already exists within the organisations, you might find the starting or the building of a structure of a delivery model for a particular apprenticeship, or that these things could actually be used to actually support some of the components of the apprenticeships as well. So definitely an irony that what we sort of are trying to service and encourage outwardly, is the biggest challenge for us as education and training providers. But there are opportunities there. I think, I hope you'd agree, Bally, but there's such a need or an opportunity to be able to deliver training specifically in training providers to what we might categorise as delivery and support staff. So those that have got the biggest sort of contact time maybe with apprentices and employers, but they're probably the most likely to be able to attend some of that sector training that I know we support or is available to them. And that simply sits because it's kind of the challenges around capacity issues or structured timetables, and that makes it really difficult. But again, it's not necessarily a lack of intention or willingness to engage with some of that. It comes down to the framework in which internally that education sector is so challenged by, where you mentioned earlier on about sort of the lack of freedom or the time available to do that, when really they're the ones that we could really support, that need that dedicated training and support to stay up to date with the provision and areas, and they're probably the quickest way that we can support improvements with, by getting to that targeted audience. I know we've had conversations outside of this Bally with some of our colleagues that sometimes the show of that audience type to some of the other programmes that we support is limited, when we'd really want to be able to see more of those delivery and support staff attending some of that CPD as well. So there's just another lens, and I think that sort of comes around to this idea that hopefully supports training providers in having this conversation and can see linkages to apprenticeships. But we see more often than not, even if there is a comprehensive plan around staff CPD in training provision or education providers, we see sometimes that it's quite focused on making sure that delivery staff, teaching staff, assessing staff, whoever it might be, have some way of a structure to make sure that they've got dedicated time to stay industry, or what we would say sector, occupationally competent, up to date. But there's a dual professional requirement, I believe, around the development of apprenticeship support staff or provision staff, where there is a requirement in this ever-changing world and sector in which we exist, with all of these multiple components and changes, not just specifically apprenticeships, but the education sector. There's a requirement of training providers, whether it's through educational provision or through their staff development policies, to make sure that we're capturing that dual professional requirement, where we stay up to date with maybe our occupational standards and practice for the sector in which we serve or represent, but also that lens is widened to our sort of educational and training representation or role and responsibility as well.
Thank you so much, Natalie. So we've discussed the challenges at length. Let's discuss what the solutions are. We've kind of touched upon it earlier in the podcast, but let's dive straight into it. So what exactly are the solutions to all these challenges in dealing with apprenticeship funding and whatnot? And how can this be resolved? Bally, let's hear from you first. What are the solutions that come to mind for you?
I think for me, it really has to start with a top-down, bottom-up, sideways approach. For me, I think the only one word that kind of encompasses that is culture. And I've been lucky enough to work for a really brilliant training provider, apprenticeship training provider, where they had all of this really stitched up. They're really forward-thinking, really progressive, disruptive. One of your favourite words there, Vinh. I know you use that every other word in your sentences. So, really disruptive, really forward-thinking, really progressive. And I think also, we worked with some really progressive customers and brands, world-class organisations, global firms. So I think because at the point at which I joined the organisation, they were already like that. And I know that they had a consulting arm as well. So from my perspective, having joined PERA at the time, they were very much kind of ahead of the curve from any other provider that I'd worked with, either on the PAYE or as an advisor. And when I was employed there, like I said, just everything they did, the kind of diagnostics, their training, needs assessments, relationships, use of social media, use of digital media, use of IT, systems integration, using colleagues from consulting arms, knowledge transfer, and just being very, very into all their knowledge and insights and using insights to move forward. It was just massive. And I think knowledge transfer from one person to another through training was also big. So if I were to encompass all of that, probably given a bit too much of a description, it'd be the one word, it'd be culture. So you've got to have a culture of development. You've got to have a culture of being a learning organisation. I know we've heard these words and sometimes they can just be words, but they actually do exist. And I do feel that Pira very much were a learning organisation. They were very interested in learning. They were very interested in developing their own staff. They were very interested in understanding what happens at ground zero in all their relationships with and all touch points as well with clients, and then improving upon that. I mean, for example, we were updating our curricula and our learning assets materials every 3 months for some of our organisations, because that's how quickly they moved from a world-class quality perspective. When they're delivering globally, we had to move at the same time. So I think as a result, that breeds that kind of excellence. You have to move on, if you like, if you can call it excellence, but you see what I'm saying? You have no choice but to move with the times as well. So that pushed everybody through that sausage machine automatically, if you like, because the industry was changing for some of our organizations, our clients, so fast that we had to move with them. And when you turned inwards then, so when you're working with clients like that on the outside, when you turn inwards, you automatically either do it yourselves or you're just of that, you just made of that DNA. So I found in this organization that, you know, we had our own learning academy. There was a leadership and management academy, and you know, academy, even with a small a, you know, you had your own folders, you had your own time that was earmarked for your development. You had to be attending those development sessions, from everybody from leaders, governors, right the way through to finance. There was all sorts of training going on. So I already mentioned that I had a team of 9 apprentices myself that I coached and mentored. That was just in one area of the business. There was the same in other parts of the business. There was all sorts of CEPD facilitated by external consultants, technical training for even trainers, occupationally linked. All of our deliverers, our trainers were from industry. So that was really helpful. So there was almost like this reciprocal coaching mentoring program that was in place through that knowledge transfer. So, you know, for me, it was a stark difference to my experience working in colleges, for example, you know, and then using these sort of sophisticated, you know, diagnostic tools, techniques. And obviously my background in business links lent itself very, very well to working at Pira as well, because I found that they were very, very similar in nature, very, very forward thinking, etc. So it was great. It was a great ecosystem. It was brilliant to, you know, push ourselves as individuals and work alongside, you know, really forward thinking companies. But equally, we kept our own personal and professional standards high through all of the training that was available through us, you know, via apprenticeships or otherwise. So that's that. I'm really delighted really to be able to give an example where I personally found it went really, really well, and they were doing more than potentially what was even kind of required. But it's down to each and every provider in terms of what they do, how seriously they take their staff training, development, policy, plans, priorities, etc. But again, it's all about the culture. Are they a learning organisation? Are they aspiring to be a learning organisation, or are they somewhat away from that as a target in terms of where they want to be?
Well, I couldn't agree more. Culture is definitely paramount to the success of any organisation, and of course within the apprenticeship sector too. And again, Bally, I do agree with you. I absolutely love the word disruption, especially if it is for the betterment of the apprenticeship sector. Natalie, I just wanted to get your thoughts on that too. Is there anything that you wanted to add, or any other solutions that you feel that can resolve these challenges that we've mentioned?
I think I completely agree. It's probably just extending on sort of some ways to capture that culture and that change and that lead from the top. And I think It's a very strategic style conversation about this, regardless of the size of the organisation. It's things like conducting training needs analysis or understanding what your training needs are within your organisation, if that's something that you regularly do, aligning that with the kind of vision objectives or in your strategy or your the organisational objectives, and seeing how not just apprenticeships but training and development can really support fill in the gaps, sort of succession plan within your workforce and your team and your staff, but also could really contribute to sort of the quick progression in some of those areas and needs that are identified. So it'd really be about taking some of that slightly more strategic view or overview of pulling together lots of bits of vision really, and trying to bring them aligned and bring that into the conversation, which I hope you'd agree is something that would then sort of start cultivating change around that culture if it is led from the top and part of the overall vision. And the cascading of those expectations through the organisation is something that you would be able to take forward. I think in simple terms, people need to sort of really explore and think, maybe zoom out of what they're delivering as a training provider and see that there are much wider, broader subject matters or available apprenticeships to them. So I'm not picking on anyone, but just by way of example, if you're delivering construction or trade or engineering is in your main sector, maybe across the organisation people haven't stopped to think about the wider apprenticeship offer outside of their sort of focused historic or their current approach in certain sectors, to see that there's all of these available standards and ambitions to develop further ones that could support their organisation. So it's sometimes taking stock. And then I think it's about, we've said it a couple of times between us, about that internal lens and that reflective practice to take a moment to look and look inwards. And I think it goes by that saying, if you can start with that, if you can start with you as an organisation, and you will have the opportunity to reflect and find ways to raise the profile of the foundation in which your external service is supported. And that's going to benefit both internally to the organisation to identify opportunity, identify ways of working that you could strengthen this part of your provision. And that's then ultimately going to be a positive byproduct or an extension to the service in which you externally offer as well. So that internal reflection, that internal review, that internal development strategies only going to have positive outputs to your external service, even if that's just better understanding of what we're asking of our employers, or you develop other ways or unpick solutions or tools that would extend and provide another layer to the service in which you support our apprentices and our employers externally as well.
I think that's all been particularly valuable. If anyone was wondering what the solution is, I think we pretty much made it very, very clear. Thank you, Natalie, and thank you, Bally. Let's help everyone out just a bit more if they're wondering where to start. Can you provide any tips, Natalie, on where they can start in implementing these solutions?
Absolutely. Again, I think the tips are to sort of look internally, like we've said, just not to extend the points, but to conduct that training need analysis, understanding the aspirations of their team as well as the development needs. It comes down to, if we look at more operationally, it's sort of caseload planning and staff planning. Do we have all the identified roles within the organisation that we need? Are there gaps within our staff portfolio? Could we attract or develop internal staff to develop their skills that way? So I think I'd start by sort of understanding the current picture through training needs, staff needs and organisational needs, and pulling that all together. Another top tip as well, and this goes across like sharing best practice, is something that we would say to a lot of people. People are doing this well. There is opportunities that aren't being utilised, and there are challenges for some provision that we see and know that haven't really quite mastered this, or coming up against challenges that we talked about today. But there are people out there that absolutely have this embodied in their practice, are utilising it, it's part of their conversation, and run extremely successful and well considered and delivered apprenticeship provision internally. So it's about reaching out to our networks, to colleagues, and trying to sort of maybe see what are the best practices out there as well, and learning from that. So because there's such value in being able to do that across the sector.
That's amazing, Natalie. Thank you. And Bally, of course, your insights will be invaluable to everyone. What top tips would you suggest and where they can start?
I think I've sat here and listened to Natalie, and it's, whenever you listen to your colleagues talk about issues, problems, challenges, potential solutions, you just come up with more stuff. And just I've made some notes whilst Natalie was talking, and if you think, what is the problem in our sector at the moment, and we do have a skills shortage. We're no different. We're not immune from skills issues and shortages, just like the engineering sector is, care, adult, childcare. We have a shortage of trainers, assessors, and even if providers aren't experiencing that at the moment, you're in a very good place. But overall, there is a shortage of good trainers, good assessors, functional skills tutors, quality assurers, and even governors and leaders, managers in these circles. If you lose somebody who's extremely experienced in this sector, who's potentially worked 15, 20, 25 years in this sector, it can be quite difficult to find them, because you've now got to look further down the food chain to see, okay, how many new teachers are coming, how many new assessors are coming, how many new skills coaches are coming, how many new learning mentors are coming through the ranks, and actually how diverse are they? What's the diverse? Do we have to recruit them, or do we have them in our organization? Can we put them on a talent management plan? And we don't often do that. So I believe there is a shortage of skills that we are experiencing currently. And I think that if we as a sector don't look inwards, we could potentially be at risk of not having enough staff to grow. So this could stifle our growth in the near future. But even if you look at how can apprenticeships help us as a sector? Well, they can help with the recruitment issues, retention issues, obviously learning and development issues, which is what we've been talking about. Succession planning is a massive one because of the problems and shortages. So, if you were to do a whole review of, well, okay, are we at risk or are we not? Then I think you should get some answers. So that would be a top tip, really. My top tip would be to do that review. Have a look at where your numbers, what is your headcount currently? Do you have a shortage? Where is that shortage? And then do you have other development needs in terms of training? Some of this can be offset with apprenticeships, apprenticeship funding, put an individual on those programs. You might have to recruit, you might put existing staff on apprenticeship training programs, and you start to develop your skills pipeline. You start to safeguard your business, you start to protect your business from a potentially vulnerable position in the near future or in the future. I don't have any particular stats. I wish I did. I'm quite geeky about data and stats. Both of you know that. I wish I had some stats in terms of, do we have enough trainers, learning mentors, assessors, trainers, functional skills tutors, quality assurers for the next 5 years? I don't have that information, but I wish I did, because if I had to guess, I'd probably say we are running into a shortage. We are, because how many individuals from schools, colleges, or even the private sector suddenly think one morning that actually I'll go and become a learning mentor for apprenticeships, or I'll go and become a functional skills tutor, or I'll do it part-time. I might have retired from one industry, but I'll quite happily give my time to this industry, or I'll become a full-time. And then other packages, that are available, that sort of salaries and remuneration, are they comparable to industry? So, or are we developing people from scratch to be able to start and stay in this sector and think of it as a really great career opportunity for them? So it is turning that lens inwards. I think it's really tough when you do it for everybody else, but not yourself. And I think that's where the challenge is. I mean, everything else that Nat's mentioned in terms of starting with that business review, having a look at what your training policy is, working through that with an organisational training needs analysis, priorities, all of that sort of stuff. I think that's probably, a given. But actually, if you were to think strategically, which is exactly what I agree with Natalie, you really have to stop and think, are we at risk here? Are we going to suffer the same issues that actually we try and help our clients with in terms of that loss of skills through even redundancies, or people, natural wastage, if you like, to another sector, or just they leave, they've retired. Can we bring them back into the sector on a part-time basis? All of that stuff. Where are we? Where is our organisation on that particular note? I don't know if any of that's helped. I don't know if there's any top tips in there, but yeah, I think that's kind of what was going through my mind.
Well, regardless, it definitely helped. And with that, thank you so much both to yourself, Bally, and thank you again to yourself also, of course, to Natalie, for providing some amazing insights on the challenges and solutions to apprenticeship training providers internally. So thank you again. And with that, thank you also to listening to us until the next time. Take care.